You're listening to Blind Shovel, an arts and music podcast. Today I have the pleasure of speaking with Sarah Rothberg, new media artist and poet of sorts. Enjoy.
Hello.
Hi. Hold on.
How are you?
I'm good. I'm wondering if you can hear me okay.
It's pretty good.
Cool.
So you're in Brooklyn, right?
I'm in Brooklyn.
We met in Oakland. Is that
we
correct?
probably met in Oakland, yeah.
You had like a nice side balcony thing, some trees. I could be wrong.
Yeah, if you came to my place. I think that you, me, and Neve went to a drawing class once or something.
Oh, yes, in a living room.
Yes, that is. Yeah. But it's confusing because I feel like I knew you before that because I had been looking at your and Neve's like collab drawings. So
that's an interesting time.
Yeah.
So why were you in Oakland again?
I went to school. I went to Berkeley for undergrad, and then I was just doing like living in a house with a bunch of people, trying to like figure out what to do with my life. I was just living there.
And your major wasn't like art, right? It's art adjacent.
I studied poetry.
Well, that counts.
No
right?
idea what I was up to.
Wow,
yeah.
how many schools do you major in poetry? Is that correct?
No, I majored in I guess at Berkeley it was English literature, and then I had a minor in creative writing, but I basically just took like a lot of experimental writing classes, like both in terms of the stuff I was like reading and also what writing was like. I don't know, that was a really specific world that I don't feel so part of anymore, but then still feel connected to also in a lot of ways. I don't know.
Is that because as a younger individual you were mainly attracted to writing?
Yeah. I mean, here was sort of the like way I got into that, which was I think that I didn't really have a lot of like belief in myself in learning skills. Like I didn't take art classes, and I didn't know how to like do anything with my computer or like, but I was like a really creative kid, and I was really so I was just into writing because I feel like it was accessible to me. Like I was like, oh yeah, I can do this. And so I think that's the thing I'll always love about poetry is like you don't need to know anything to be able to write a poem. If you like know language, you can make a poem. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that was sort of like how I ended up in that world. And it's still like I kind of still like yearn for that feeling. I mean, right, I guess drawing is like that too, but I wasn't very good at drawing. So I think I gave up because I didn't have like a natural aptitude for it, you know?
Yeah, poetry is bizarre to me because I very much value the poetic spirit, but I find it to be like a carcass of a medium. And I don't know why. And that's not a personal opinion. I just feel like it has no particular relevance in society. And there's no reason it shouldn't, by any normal metric. Like it still functions. It's people still read. Maybe people don't understand poetry as much in general, like that relationship to reality. But I've always been fascinated by like, well, people who want to be poets, you don't meet many, but how do they make money? How would they make money? Surely you saw some of that, but that also had to be a discussion in those circles, right? Like, why is poetry so irrelevant? Or am I just being super harsh about poetry?
No, I mean, it's actually really funny because that was a really important conversation among my friends at that time. God, I haven't thought about this in a while. So I think I knew at that age that like to be a poet wasn't like a real, like you couldn't have a career being a poet, or you couldn't like, you know, but there's something very like visceral about it. Like, and I think because I came into it like in a really honest way, I had a love for it, and I liked the social aspect of it, because like these creative writing classes were kind of like, if you imagine it, it's like a bunch of like 18-year-olds or whatever. We all wrote poems, and then we all sat there and took them super seriously and tried to understand this like really fundamental unit of expression, language, and what does it mean to like use that in a not utilitarian way. Like, you're not using poetry to try to communicate something clearly, right? So like you're using it to do something else. And for me, that's what, I mean, to be like totally lofty from the get-go, but like I think art is about like using a material or a medium for something that's like not necessarily utilitarian in any straightforward way. And so the social aspect really brought me in. But I think that a lot of people, when they think of poems, they think of being like forced to read poetry in high school, as opposed to, or just like really cringy stuff, like that's really ego driven and not about like something deeper. Like I think a lot of people think of like slam poetry, which has never really been something I'm interested in, or like people think about like sonnets or whatever, but I don't know.
Haikus are still respected and great.
I don't know. I recommend trying to read some poetry, like some contemporary writing, because I think if you're like, I've like gone in and out of being able to be into it, but right now my friend suggested this book to me the other day, and I was reading it and I was like, this is fucking crazy. Like, it's crazy that you can use language in this way that's like beautiful, but in a way that's hard to define. And even though language is this like fundamental communication method, it can also be turned into something that's like the thing for its own sake and communicates in its own way. So I don't know, I'm on like a pro poetry, but I definitely know why people hate it. It's just because there's a lot of like cringy bad stuff. And I think a lot of people have forced memories of being forced to try to like unpack it or whatever.
Well, I think that's a given, right? Every medium has a lot of horrible, like, you know, 95% of it's going to be bad. But to me, what's interesting is the 5% of poetry that is good is still irrelevant, you know, and like I'm an open, somewhat. What do you
mean by relevant?
Irrelevant, in the sense of like, you know, I think about it a lot with art or comics, right? Versus music. You know, music is just a medium that will always be relevant, probably because it's really good at brainwashing people. So the powers that be are like, this is a useful tool. And so it gets propped up. It's also more ephemeral and can kind of, I don't know how to, it can like haunt people. It can enter into people in a very different way. But I know that comics will never be relevant to a certain degree. Doesn't mean they're not good. It just means that there's something inherent about the medium that, you know, is like pretty specific to a certain moment in time. And I just think it isn't as timeless as a song. Now, poetry is closer to music, I would think, but I don't know who the most famous poet is right now. That's what I mean by relevant. Like, I can't even, there was a time where there was pretty big names in poetry. And actually the art center I work at is named after William Carlos Williams, who I really like. But I feel genuinely, and I could just be out of it, that I don't know who the last super, super relevant poet is, but perhaps you would know.
Yeah, I mean, there's worlds. I mean, it's like, there's worlds in the same way that there's like dance. Like, I don't know much about dance. I think I can name like one or two living choreographers, but I know that there's like a huge dance community that's like has this whole universe. So it's interesting. I guess that's why I'm asking you about what do you mean by relevant? And I guess what you mean is like mass culture, like
yeah. I mean, I live in a suburb.
Culture, relevant.
You know what I mean? Like yeah. I like to use that metric. I used to use it as a negative metric. You know, like if it to be crude. It's like, if my parents like this drawing, then maybe it's not good.
That's funny. I have the opposite feeling about my art. If my mom likes my art, I'm like, okay, cool. Like, I didn't go somewhere too weird. Like,
yeah, no, I was on some other shit. I'm not really on that anymore at all. But yeah, I don't want to belabor the point on poetry. I find it very interesting as like a topic, Yeah. And I actually like writing it. But I also feel that when I write it, that I am very like aware of its lack of power in a sense.
Yeah.
And that's a bizarre feeling. I view it as like more of an underlying mechanism, especially in my comics. Like, I make comics that are very poetic and are about rhythm and repetition and musical. They're not as narrative driven, but I feel that poetry in and of itself, and maybe this is where you ended up because that's not your main thing, is something that's embedded and underlying in good art, but it isn't necessarily that intriguing in and of itself anymore for some reason.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely one of the reasons that I felt like the limit of what I could do as a poet, as like a primary creative identity. But it's funny, it's like one of those things that I feel like, I was talking about this with this other artist, and we were talking about like elemental aspects of art making, and like, especially like, now most of my artwork is like with all this crazy interactive stuff, and like, but everyone who does new media usually came from at least at this time, usually came from a different background. Like, they came from music, or they came from, painting, or they came from poetry, or they came from film. And like, when you really see that sort of like elemental, I don't know, orientation in the work that the people that I know in this like new media world kind of draw from. And like, for me, it's like poetry is like, it's this weird, just like ideas, language space. So I still like writing poetry a lot, but like, I'm not trying to like make that, I don't need other people to read this. Like, I'm not trying to like put this in front of anybody necessarily.
Right. Well, can you explain the connection between, and new media is just a tough one to grapple with too, but like, perhaps
it's so fucked up.
Well, it's just like a very relative notion. Will it become old? Then is it just media? Mm-hmm. But how does what you do now in new media, and surely you can elaborate on that, relate to your prior studies of poetry?
Was like a poet. Well, like, oh yeah, new media, first of all, just to kind of like go with what you're saying, is like, it's a fucking weird word. Sorry, am I allowed to curse on your podcast? I'm guessing.
Yes. Yeah,
I don't know why I wouldn't be, but just trying to be polite.
No, that's nice of you.
I feel like new media is really funny because there's the haters and there's the lovers of that term. But I personally like it because for me, it means the work that you're doing is about engaging with new media, whatever the new medium is at that time. So like, okay. But for some people it's weird because it gets dated. So like, video art was a new medium, but now there's video artists that just work with video, right? But like, so some people say like emerging media, or like for me, I for a while was saying interactive media because I was actually really interested in the idea of like the interaction itself as like the art part. But like, I guess the relationship to poetry is like, God, this is so, I don't really talk about this in this way very often. So I'm a little like embarrassed about how like, I don't know. It makes me feel a little navel-gazy, but I do think about this stuff a lot. So,
well, that's what this podcast is. So,
all right. Well, caveat said. But I guess like it's back to that same thing of like, I'm interested in the elements of communication, like language or computation or sound or visual or interaction, and then taking that thing and rendering it not like for a useful purpose, but for something that can't be expressed in another format. So like, in the same way that I feel like language is like a fucked up form of writing or poetry, sorry, is a fucked up form of writing or language. Like, I think that is like a piece that persisted with the stuff that I'm doing now. And also language does play like literally a big part in the stuff that I do. A lot of the time I have like pieces of writing or words inside of this stuff that I'm making. But yeah, I don't know if that made any sense.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's not a correct translation, but it's almost like what's between the cracks in language or words themselves. There's obviously a lot lost, especially in English. It's very utilitarian, direct language. In respect to new media, I guess what I'm first intrigued by is, do you truly embody that spirit? Like, are you attracted by everything new? So you see AI tools and you're like, I need to use those immediately.
I mean,
I need to go to the edge of that and explore it. Or do you have moments of being a Luddite, or you're kind of in an Amish mode where you're more cautious?
That is such a tricky question, because I think there's like the path. I mean, it's interesting because right now I also feel like I'm at a little bit of a fork in the road in my art making that deals a little bit with this question. But like the kind of like trajectory from connecting the dots from like poetry to like where I ended up was like, I started like studying code and technology and blah, 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 and made this like connection between the reason that I was interested in writing in the first place was because I had a computer growing up. And I had this like feeling of like, oh, it wasn't actually poetry necessarily that I was even initially interested in, but it was like using language on the computer. And like, I guess because of that, I ended up like studying all this stuff and then continually trying to like challenge myself to make things with new technologies like as they emerged. And that became kind of like not just like habitual, but reinforced by my context, right? Because like I teach at a program that is all emerging media, and all of the like artists I surround myself are people working with emerging media. So it's like I have this like little like ear out for like what's happening in technology, like what is going on, and like what might that feel like, or what might it do to people, or what might it do to me as a person. And because we're like living in a world that's constantly steeped in like emerging technologies, it's not that hard to just like have your lens out for that. So even when I'm like not, I mean, it's not like every single emerging tool or emerging technology I like jump into, but there are certain ones that like spark my interest, and I usually go at them with like an open question, right? Which is not to say like, oh, this is a good technology or this is a bad technology, or I want this technology to succeed or fail. But like my questions are usually like, what is it like to use this thing? And like, I think for a long time, that's what's been the kind of like nature of the artwork that I make is that question. But now I'm not sure. Now I'm like, I don't know. Am I going to keep working in that mode or not?
Yeah, because it's an interesting identity, in a sense, it's defined by a more temporal thing, new, just new. Or in a sense of progress, this kind of blind faith that the new is worth adopting. And I think it's interesting because I see the world and I don't really understand why I respect Amish people. It's very interesting how we just see a new thing and we go, all right, we're doing it.
Well, I got to clarify, because I don't know that it means for me that I think I occupy like a really specific place in that sense, in that I don't think because something is new, we should adopt it. But I feel like my weird role in this ecosystem of like art and technology is to be like, oh, I notice people are using this. Let me understand it by making things with it. And like, it's part of a kind of a larger like place I fit into it as a teacher and as like a person who like engages in like a critical technology practice. Like, but it's super academic. It's a very like, okay, so like AI is this emerging tool, like, let me make something with it and then let me give an artist talk around, like, what do I think the dangers of this tool is? So it's not like a cheerleader for the technology, though I think a lot of new media artists are that. There's just as many who I think have this, like, maybe contradictory in the end, but like goal of having like a critical approach to technology. It's confusing though, because sometimes you get caught up in one side or the other. Like, I came into doing VR because I was like, this is a bad thing, and then I spent like 5 years making things that I'm like, I actually really like making things on this tool. Like,
Yeah.
So I don't know.
I think it's deeply complex in general, and I suppose that clarifies a certain sense of detachment. It's more of a anthropological study of like this technology as opposed to, let's say I used AI within a business context that has a larger social ramification more immediately.
Yeah.
It changes the contours of commerce and how people experience buying things. Whereas the academic approach tends to be more detached, but at the very least it implies a curiosity about the new. Whereas I'm increasingly at 35 beginning to understand what it means to go down with the ship in some sense, where you kind of find what you believe to be beautiful to do and to live, and then you aren't trying to wear skinny jeans until you're 80, And there's merits to both. I think there's a graceful way to navigate in both modalities, but it is very fascinating, I think, because of its vagueness. Even if you were to talk to some random 50-year-olds on the street and they ask you what you do and you say you're a new media artist or a listener of the podcast, it evokes quite a bit without being precise. And I suppose it would make sense to talk about precisely some of these projects so people understand how you grapple with these things.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I really, really get so self-conscious when people ask me what I do.
Well, what do you say?
Describe your art. Well, it depends on who it is. Like, if I have to, I feel like if I'm going to really fall down like a hard to answer rabbit hole, I'll just tell them that I'm a professor. And then they'll be like, of what? And then I'm like, interactive media art. I have to be like, and then people kind of conjure something in their heads. And like, sometimes it's right, but then sometimes they think it's like I teach like graphic design or something, which is not what I've been doing at all. But
so what do you do?
I can give you some examples of some stuff I'm working on. Like, I have a long ongoing, this is like this weird body of work that just like never, every time I think I'm done with it, like something different happens with it. So let me think about this piece that I'm going to describe is called New Meetings, and it's like a kind of a format that I've worked in for a while, which is like avatar performance. So like, it was maybe like 2021 when I started this piece, and I had like all of this like skill set in making VR stuff because that had been a format I had been working in for a long time. And I wanted to like, I had this like funny feeling inside of me where it's like, okay, it's 2021. We've had this like weird shift where most people I know are having all their interactions on Zoom instead of like in person. And, Mark Zuckerberg is out there with his like metaverse, but like no one wants to use that. And if ever it were going to be used, right, it would be now. So that was like one strain of the thinking that went into this piece. And then the other was kind of like, so like I wanted to like make some piece that had this like social component that was like about VR or used VR in some way, but also just let me kind of like connect and chit chat with people and think about how like interfaces like Zoom were kind of changing the way people talk to each other. Especially for me, I'd been teaching in the pandemics like a lot, and I was on Zoom nonstop with people, and it was like really interesting. So, to say the least. So this piece is like, there's two ways to experience this piece. There's like the audience side, and then there's the participant side. So most of it I think of for the audience. But I'll explain it from the participant point of view because it'll make more sense. Basically, wearing a VR headset and embodying this like avatar in a space, and someone else is given a headset. They're in a different space, and I don't know who they are, but we're both embodied in these avatars, and we meet inside this virtual space and have basically, not unlike this, like a totally open-ended conversation where we start by sort of like laying down the ground rules of like, what kinds of things are you interested in talking about? Or like, do you want to like have a silly conversation or like a rapid fire conversation? But it becomes clear after a while that as you talk, you're on this virtual platform that's getting raised like higher and higher. So like, if you're talking a lot and I'm not talking at all, you'll be like way taller than me and I have to look up at you. So it's kind of like a visualization of how much of the conversation each person has been like pushing forward. Like who's talked more, basically, whoever's talked.
Cool.
And then it's like reveal, like I tried to like in the performances of these sort of push to be like, okay, you know, by the end, this is a meeting, it's an open-ended meeting about whatever. It's like the opposite of a regular meeting where there's some kind of agenda. But by the end, there's like in the virtual space, I guess it would be somewhere between like 20 to 100 feet. I'm not good at estimating high. There's like this little orb that we both have to reach the top of this space and touch this orb to be able to exit the meeting. So some of the conversations were like really balanced and natural. And some of the conversations, like I was like asking the other person like tons and tons of questions to get them to be able to like reach the top of the meeting with me. And some like the other person like totally monopolized the conversation and I had to keep interrupting them for us to get to the top. And then
even when they were aware of this goal?
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Super fascinating. So that's like the participant's point of view. And then the audience sees this whole thing as like a weird animated, like flat video. So I live streamed them, but then I also like recorded them and cut them into like shorter, like you would a podcast basically. So that was this piece called New Meetings that I think I did about like 30 times or so. And then evolved out of that was another version that I ended up calling New Meetings, where the other character wasn't a person, but they were in the same avatar embodied by ChatGPT, which was like a crazy experience because it was so boring for me to talk to ChatGPT that much. But the video pieces came out kind of interesting. And then now I'm working on a version where the two avatars are both different embodiments of like a ChatGPT like engine. So I'm making these like conversation engines where these two like characters are in this like infinite loop generative conversation with each other, but they're experienced as like animations, kind of like, if that makes sense. I don't know.
No.
That was a long explanation. I'm
no, but
sorry.
That's a very, your platform is way too high.
Yeah.
No,
exactly.
no, that's an interview.
Exactly.
No, I think that's a very, in some ways, concise explanation of what you do, because I feel like it encapsulates so many things at once. And, you know, that was pretty easy to understand. And it's not where I expected it to go. You know, I think it's kind of, I like that it's just fundamentally simple. I don't know if you draw conclusions from these things, but I like that, at least in presentation, as you just did, like, it's not reaching for some lofty conclusion in and of itself, but people can make their own deductions from a very simple mechanism like the platform's height.
I really appreciate that. Like, I do feel like a longtime collaborator who's like a kind of like, I've worked with for a long time, but she was my teacher. And, you know, so it like words from her mean a lot. She said this really sweet thing to me just last week where she's like, your work is only about asking questions. Like, and I'm like, oh my God, I feel so warmed by that. Like, I feel really like it makes me, because I don't know. And I feel like there's like a play, like I like to play and I like to make space to play and I like to make space for others to feel like even when they're watching it, they feel like a playful question mark around it and not like a, hey, I'm a smarty pants, like check out all of my smart thoughts. So yeah, I appreciate that assessment of it also.
Well, I think we're exhausted by answers, and I don't mean that like, and I mean incorrect answers largely, but that in art of the last couple of decades, there's just been this propensity and a moral imperative in some sense to provide answers to things that no one was asking questions about, or maybe in certain bubbles they were. And to me, that is not what art is about. I think some art, potentially devotional art, is about, you know, playing with answers, but they still are very, very much opening you up. They're not propagandizing the experience or being didactic. So I find that it makes sense in an interactive sense. You wouldn't really want to, and you maybe couldn't even close it off in that sense the way a film could. You know, a film can kind of tell you a moral, but with interactive art, I assume in a good way, it's probably very hard to be that tyrannical. You know, directing is very tyrannical, for better or for worse.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot in terms of like goal orientation versus play, which I also feel like is the same like split between like design and art, or I guess sometimes even like storytelling. And I mean, maybe this is going too far, but like I think another way of thinking of that is like narrative versus poetry, like that there's this kind of like, okay, I'm driving you to think this thing, or I'm trying to win at this game, or I'm trying to design something that will make you buy it, or explain something to you like really clearly, versus like, let's just all get scrambled and like float around and then see what happens without any answers.
Is that attractive to you because you are inherently goal driven?
No, I'm not goal driven at all. And I feel like I live in a world of goals, and
of course,
like it's so hard. It's so hard to be a person that's just like, I just want to play, and to just be like, oh, right, like that's not the way that anything actually works.
Interesting. No, I mean, I asked the question because I think I'm particularly goal driven, but it's never done me any harm, honestly. I never quite understood the lamentations of like, you know, this is it's a restrictive thing, yes, but I find it to be a meaningful and helpful thing at the end of the day. As long as you understand, of course, the very trite idea that the journey is what it's about. Of course, I think that's very obvious. Doesn't contradict having a goal. But you're a professor, and, you know, having employed people, it's pretty hard to employ people who are really just about play, I find, you know.
Yeah.
So you must have some element to yourself, and maybe it's the side that you begrudgingly utilize that is, you know, more oriented towards actually structure and goal.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. Like, and I think it's just like an internal struggle, because it's like, I was just talking about this with someone else. I'm like a very actually good like project manager, for example. Like if I'm working with other people, or if I'm like setting my class up, or if I have students that need like a lot of structure or guidance, I'm like, okay, like let's do it. Like here's how it's going to go, you know? And I think I have like a kind of a skill for that. And I think that it's almost like having a skill for that is what makes it like frightening to me, because I just see, I don't know, I see like an oversubscription to that way of thinking in general in like today's world, like efficiency. And I mean, goal orientation is kind of a loaded word, because it can mean a lot of different things, right? Like,
sure. Just like production can, right? Like,
yeah,
you know, I completely understand what you mean. And, you know, there's like an artist thinking about being productive versus a finance bro or something.
Right.
And they're just not the same. I feel like they can get kind of conflated when they're in completely different service. You know, like let's imagine you're in worked with a charity. Like, yeah, sure, you'd want to be productive and helping others in a sense. But then there is this kind of mechanistic, robotic productivity that is bad. But I don't think, obviously consumption can be good or bad, mostly bad, I would argue. But I'm kind of curious to know if that philosophy of play has spiritual or religious implications, because I find that, and I could be remembering this incorrectly, but I believe in Hinduism that the idea of the world is more just like a dance. It's more, and a dance for me implies a sense of play.
Yeah.
And obviously Judeo-Christian things, which I subscribe to, is much more goal-oriented. I would say goal-oriented straight up. It's very meaning-drenched. It's very binary in some ways. So I'm curious if there's any spiritual implications to that.
I mean, I think there's a lot of different ways of thinking about that. Like, if you think in, like, the meaning of life is to, like, avoid hell and, like, do the right thing. But, like, I don't know, specifically, like, I wouldn't say that I'm a religious person, but I was, like, definitely raised Jewish. And I feel like the questioning, like, when I really search in my heart, like, why I love questions so much, I think I can trace it back to that, like, part of my culture. I'm like, well, because there's no answers and you just have to constantly be, like, posing questions over and over and over again until the end of time. And there's something playful about that. Like,
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a playful thing to being like, let's debate. Like, let's like, or let's like, wax poetic about goals is like a pretty like pointless in a way, right? Like pointless and playful, because I don't think that we're, even for example, in this conversation, it's not like you're trying to get a specific answer. We're trying to build an idea. That's something I'm super interested in in my art making in general too, is like conversation as like a platform for idea production. Like making new knowledge or making ideas through conversation is like something that's been like at the top of my mind for the last like 5 years or something.
Yeah, it reminds me, have you ever read the Glass Bead game?
No, but I should write it down.
It's a monstrous book, but I managed to... It's by Hermann Hesse, Steppenwolf.
Yeah.
It's the last book he ever wrote, but what you just said made me think of it. If you can muster the strength, it's tough when you get to be like 30-something to read 800-page books, but because I find disappearing into another world really hard now, which I'm fine with. Like I had my time. I had plenty of time. And the reason I mention it, it's super, super interesting book where it's in the future. It doesn't feel super futuristic, but there's almost like this monastery of elite intellectuals who synthesize information via like Bach's theory of music. So they'll take something like, I don't know, some mantras of the East or something, and then you could say Caravaggio's paintings, and they use, like, they don't really explain it in the book that much, but they use like this crazy formula to synthesize those two ideas via speech into a new idea. And so they figure out a way to systematize speech for just synthesizing new ways of seeing the words and life itself. So they'll just take like two disparate things. It's crazy.
It's very AI. I hate to say it, but it's so AI. Like it's so
I'm going to be hearing that for the rest of my life.
Yeah, sorry.
In respect to everything. When anyone does anything cool.
Sorry.
No, it's true. And except it's really elegant and human and beautiful. And I found it very interesting that music was the underlying way that those things were synthesized, and I think that comes back to poetry for me, that it's really about rhythm and melody.
Yeah.
As like these underlying, and I think life is the same exact thing to me.
Yeah.
Like you can live, there's people I know who live rhythmically and there's people who don't. And you suffer when you don't, I believe. But anyway, that's a cool book.
You can find, you will find your way back into moments where you can, I don't know how you put it, but like exit this reality into a book. I think those things ebb and flow. You said my time is over, but there's just
no. I'm joking.
There's no way.
I think I don't know, and this could be antithetical to what you're speaking of, but I have found that there's a shame and a guilt related to disappearing from this world for me, and I'm happy about that. I think, like, I used to play role-playing games when I was 15 or whatever, and this notion didn't exist. You know, I was happy to spend 3 hours in a video game, but now I feel like I'm called to, you know, genuinely interact with the limited time I have in life. And I know that's a very not playful way of seeing
I think it's
it.
interesting. I think it's interesting.
Do you know what I'm talking about? That shame, that guilt of like, I mean, of course there's elements like if you have a family, it starts to compound. But even before that for me, you know, it's funny because I'd be like, I need to productively disappear. Maybe, you know, I need to draw instead of doing this. Right. So it might be an element of production versus consumption, actually, as I'm talking this out.
I mean, there's so many things that makes me think of, because like, I think, I mean, for me, it's almost the opposite. I feel like I was like very hyper engaged in a certain way, and like that feeling like it's like the opposite. I think like the more I get older, the more I realize that this sort of like diving into different worlds and mental states is like something that I have to like, I should like protect versus, I don't know. It's interesting. I'm not really
sure. I mean, my mind is almost immediate. Like, what's the utility? Like, I found that over time, especially as I embrace design over art in a lot of ways, there is that, and I don't think it's good or bad, but you know, you could think, oh, disappearing into worlds has this utility of giving me rest from the world that I have to go back into work in. So it's like a faux sense of rest or escape. It's actually just a new way of deriving utility from this thing. You know what I mean?
Like, also think of it as like enriching versus exhausting. Like, I think there are ways you go into different worlds that are enriching, like you said, like drawing or whatever, like, which is slightly different from productive, because it's like you might not be making a thing that's useful, but maybe in its own doing, you come out of it like more ready for life. You know? Yeah.
Well, it was a wild ramble, but so what other projects? I think you describing the projects help me and everyone listening understand what you're doing. So you said that was a rather long-term project. Is there anything else of that nature?
Yeah, well, I mean, that project continues in this like new phase of these like, I mean, it's kind of a separate piece, but I'm excited about these like conversations, these like generated conversations. I don't know, some of the other work, there's some like speaking of like RPGs, like one of the projects that I do that's with this like long-term collaborator is like actually like a world's imagining game that she's been like putting out there, but that's a bit of like a pedagogical project, like in that we use it like for students and classrooms and, you know, in organizations that need to like rethink how they imagine things. That's like a cards game. And it's weird because I still think of that as interactive media, which is why I don't use the word new media or emerging technology or any of that stuff too often.
Right.
Yeah. Some other stuff I'm working on. I have like a show coming up that is going to be really weird. I have this collective. This is another really long one to explain, but I'll try to make it short. Basically, I got like pulled into this collaboration with these 3 artists that all do like live stream as art. And I guess when I got brought into the collaboration, a part of it was like trying to understand how like the platform itself could be an artwork. So basically we built a live streaming platform that was like performing the opposite of what big tech does. So like big tech is like, what's going to make us the most money? We're going to integrate those features into our platform. And we got like a small grant to make a platform for us to live stream on that was like, instead of caring about making this thing for profit, we're going to just make features that we as people live streaming want to make. So we ended up making this like website. It's called thing.tube. which is like a live streaming platform for artists. And that platform itself is going to be put into a museum show at the Museum of Moving Image. And what's really funny about it is like, it's going to be up for like 90 days. And during those 90 days, me and the other members of this collective, we all can stream directly into this installation in the museum, like at any time that we want, which like, I can't really comprehend how weird that feels. Like, I'm like, that's such a weird situation that someone might be like standing in a museum looking at what like you would normally expect to be like a static artwork or like at the, you know, maybe a video piece, right? But actually the thing that you're looking at could be happening in real time somewhere else. So I'm actually in the process of figuring out exactly what I want my stream to be, which is funny. Like I could go and do one of the things that I normally do, like an avatar performance, but I'm trying to kind of open something up that's a little less like, I mean, to be honest, like just less complicated. I kind of want the performance to be very like minimal in terms of technology beyond the fact that it's a live streamed performance. So I'm thinking about a few different routes through that. I don't know if that made sense. That's like an unclear project right now to me. So I don't know how it's
I think my first question is, how is it different than any other? Like, obviously, streaming is a pretty straightforward concept, but what makes this escape that notion? Besides the fact that it's being put in a museum, and that's the utility. Like, how would I know without that context that it's different than what big tech is trying to do?
Well, there were a couple things. First, like in the process of how we made it, we would do these like streams, and then afterward, everyone who watched the stream and all of the performers would have like basically a Zoom call where we would talk about like what we wanted to add to it. So it was like, on the one hand, it was part of it was like how it was made was this like really emergent process. And so each time we would do one of these like stream events, then we would go in and we would add different like features. So the place that it landed that I think is pretty different than what other, like what like Twitch is like, is it's kind of like an old school like web ring. Like, so you go to the homepage and you can see like a ring of people streaming. So in this case, in this version, it's just going to be us, like, you know, those who made the platform together. And you can like hop between these streams, but just in this like little ring. So it's like a little micro community of like 4 or 5 channels. The other thing that emerged out of this process was that there's like you can toggle between like a universal chat. So like on most streams, when you're chatting, you're just chatting to the room that you're in. But in ours, one thing that we noticed was like when we were doing these events, like because they were events and not really just like random live stream, like people just wanted to like talk to each other, like no matter which of the streams they were watching. So there's like a universal chat no matter which of the streams you're watching, but then there's also like the chat into the room. So like, but it's weird. It's also like it's kind of like a performance. Like for a while we were talking about it like software as performance piece, like software development as performance piece. Cause like, as we're sort of figuring out how to put it in the museum, we're also coming up with like different ways that it has to be to function in the museum. Like in that context where it's like a physical installation that people can see. But yeah, like the original stream I did for that one was a performance that was called, actually I changed the name so many times I don't even remember what it was, but basically it was like another avatar performance and people would ask me questions. Oh, it was called Good Question. It was called Good Question. And basically like as an avatar, I was like sitting in front of like a computer and then just like trying to perform finding the answers to different people's questions. And then I would like play, like I would end it with like a little like poetic, like musical sort of like answer about like whatever weird thing that I had found. Which was fun, but I don't think I want to do that again because I kind of don't feel like doing the avatar performance. It's like, it's like really a lot of it's complicated to pull off.
And when you say avatar, do you simply just mean, I mean, this means any it's a vessel, right? Like a vehicle. But is it a human? How specific are we getting?
Yeah, so the way I'd been doing it was like basically puppeting like a humanoid character using like a VR rig for basically to do motion capture. So like the controllers are the hands and the headset is the head. And then within the VR world is like I have all these controls of like what I can see. But from the outside, when you're looking at it just on a screen, it just looks like a character that's being like an animated character, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I was just curious because I can go so many different directions, you know?
Yeah, totally. Totally.
Does it resemble you, the avatar?
I don't know. Maybe sort of. I don't know.
Is that a thing you're seeking? Like, is it trying to replicate? Like, I honestly don't even. Does anyone use the metaverse?
No, I mean, yeah, some people do, but not me.
I forgot it existed.
Yeah,
thankfully,
not me.
I'm just curious. It's always an interesting thing in video games where, at least I found when I was younger, like oftentimes you just try to make the character look like you, which is a funny thing to do. But I assume there's also these modes where people are trying to do the opposite. They're trying to escape as much as they can those particular limitations.
I think for me, like, I never really considered myself like a visual artist, even though like the things that I make have to take some kind of visual form. So I just like sculpted this character to the best of my ability and then have like changed its haircut every once in a while. So
it's consistent. There's like a reoccurring element.
Yeah, there's this recurring character, but to be completely honest, it's kind of out of like lack of interest in remaking the character. So for this new body of work, I think I am going to make the characters because I think that the way that they look is going to be a part of what their selfhood is like. I mean, not the thing at the museum, but this other extension of the meetings kind of project.
So how does it feel like? I'm trying to imagine your existence outside of academia in the sense of, like, it seems like there's a fork in the road sometimes with certain studies where you will either go into like business, like self-employment, entrepreneur stuff, or working within a certain context, or there's more of an academic path. Do you feel that, or do you feel secure in that? Is that like you went to Berkeley, then which school do you teach at now? I
teach at NYU.
Okay. And do you find that most of your time is spent in academia? I know you mentioned organizations in that one context about the kind of like card game. Yeah. But do you go in between those worlds? Are you firmly in academia? Do you find that helps you foster these ideas? Could these ideas exist outside of it? Would that be tainted in your perspective by the pursuit of profit and financial stability, etc.?
I mean, yeah, this is where I'm sort of like at a fork in the road because I feel like I kind of stumbled into academia like accidentally, and there's like a feedback loop between being in that context and then making more work that only makes sense in that context.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking about. Not in a positive or negative sense. It's just interesting how those paths, they just lead to very, very different places, which I think is good, actually.
Yeah, I think it's good that in the world there is this like weird space called academia where you can make things as explorations that don't necessarily have to like generate like financial value, but like I think that I struggle with that. I mean, just to be totally frank, like even when I talk to Neve about this a lot, I'm like, what am I doing? Like, I just want to make like a kids TV show that's like really weird, or like I want to make something fun and doesn't have to take like 45 minutes to explain. Like, you know, and at the same time, like the risk involved in, like, I feel lucky that I have a pretty secure job that allows me to do these kinds of things, and that my students, you know, the school I teach in isn't really an art school. There's some students who are artists, but there are some students who like want to go on to work in tech, and like that makes it kind of complicated for me sometimes as a teacher, but it's kind of nice because it's not like I'm like perpetuating, you know, some of the like negative aspects of like the pyramid scheme of art school that it feels like sometimes can happen. Like there just isn't that many jobs for artists that want to do art as their job. And so what do they have to do? Do they have to keep teaching? Like a lot of my students they have other skills and they take on other work afterward. But in an alternate universe where I could just make things that people liked and understood and I could have fun riffing and making them, like, yeah, I would take that in a heartbeat. Would I still produce a lot of like weird shit that nobody cared about or understood? Probably, because like I still write poetry that I don't really need to share with anyone. That's weird and strange. And, you know, like, I don't know. Yeah, it's tricky. It's a very tricky time for me to try to parse a little bit of this stuff out, actually.
Yeah, I only asked because from my experience of kind of like drifting into more business-oriented practices, you know, I found a lot of that balanced me out, thankfully. Like it forced a certain type of maturity and a certain type of socialization, actually, as well. So I'm very grateful for that. But it's been a long time since I've been in that particular kind of environment, academia, and I haven't really considered, you know, there's obviously teachers who just never leave it. And it's an interesting dynamic to me, that dichotomy.
Yeah.
I don't think they're divorced, obviously. Like, there's a lot of business components to schools. I don't know how much, you know.
Oh,
and
no,
I wonder,
a lot of the work I do is administrative. Like teaching is such a small part of the job of faculty today that it's like pretty funny. Like so much of the work I do is like administrative, like trying to figure out how, you know, like how are we going to do admissions and how do we make a lab for this and what equipment do we need and which classes and how do we talk about our program. And it's so much of it is just like a job. It's like,
of course.
Yeah.
Of course. No, there's no escaping that.
Yeah.
That's just like, I think in a positive sense, it's the sacrifice we make for society. Like we don't only do what we want.
Yeah.
And that's great because we don't even know what we want. And if we only did that, we would be very limited, I think, in a certain sense.
Yeah,
so it's a good thing.
I agree. I think it's good to, I mean, even in art making, I feel like at some point, like there's the things that you do for yourself for curiosity, but I think I'm very driven by like connecting with other people like, I think inside of the work that I've been doing recently, a lot of it is just like a vehicle to connect with people and to like have those people feel whatever they feel while they're in it. But then I think that like on a broader scale, like if the work that I was making didn't have that piece to it, I would be like, what am I putting, why am I taking up space? Like what space am I taking up? You know, like, you know, it's important. I think it's like if you're making artwork as you're living, it should feel like it's a gift to the world that actually people want. You know,
in some ways, yes.
Yeah,
it's a delicate balance.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I don't know.
But so inevitably, we come to the notion of like, could you have imagined that you would have been doing what you're doing now when you were young? Or I assume because you embrace a certain playfulness that the answer is kind of no. You know, I talk to people who, when they're 5, they're drawing, and when they're 55, they're drawing, and so it was kind of a beeline, like very clear, but. How did your identity evolve from when you were very young to now?
No, well, there's no way I could have possibly imagined.
Right. That's what's interesting.
Like, there's zero way. I mean, even just the idea that I would be someone who has any sort of technical expertise, and this is something that's like a real like point of like I'm really proud of myself because I was not like raised to believe in myself in terms of being able to like gain any sort of technical knowledge or ability. So like that still surprises me to this day, even though I've been doing it for like over 10 years now. But I think that the thing that remains for me is like, I never really knew exactly how any of the stuff that I was doing would manifest, but like I knew that I wanted to have space for like playfulness and creativity and like making people laugh and maybe think. And I think that was like as far as I got in terms of the roadmap, like for myself. And I was flexible as far as like how I would get there. And I still feel like I'm on that journey. Like I don't think I've quite figured it out at all. So, but I do feel lucky that I get to continue to like be on that pursuit, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, I do think there's one must have a certain gratitude for, how would I word it? Yeah, I guess like you can really step back and realize that a lot of people's lives and their jobs have zero to do with exploration of themselves or the world.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm talking literally nothing.
Yeah.
And a lot of the people I know are very much gifted that opportunity. Obviously, that requires hard work on their part as well. But yeah, like a lot of jobs have nothing to do with self-fulfillment, self-realization, etc. So
yeah,
to even be concerned about that when working is really a luxury, I think.
it's a luxury. It also can be like a kind of a curse. I mean, to be honest,
Sure.
Like I think about like, you know, when I talk about some of this stuff with my mom, for example, she's so baffled by so many of the decisions that I've made in my life and career path. And like, it's like the idea that it's like, if I could have avoided needing to do this much, like seeking, let's just call it seeking.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I would take that out. I can't imagine it. I can't imagine not having that like weird seeking drive for something, clarity, joy, playfulness. I don't know what to call it, but like sometimes I look at people who just like kind of went the path of life of like, I will have like, I'll get a job and I'll have a family and I'll do my things and I'll have like my hobbies. And I'm like, wow, I can't even imagine. It seems so peaceful.
Oh, peaceful is how you see it. Interesting.
Seems peaceful, kind of.
Well, yeah, peace and exploration aren't necessarily, exploration is a type of, I don't know if war is the right word, but it's certainly not, it's pushing against something. It's trying to break through onto something. So I think there is a contrast often, but I'm sure there's a lack of peace there too. I mean, there's no escaping the fundamental nature of all these dynamics. It's just like they start getting compartmentalized and housed in different, avatars and vessels and subjects. And I feel like everyone's kind of just rearranging they think they're rearranging to the best of their ability these fundamental aspects of life.
Yeah, but not everyone wants to. I don't know. Some people, not everyone has this drive to like look at everything on this like, I don't know how to put it, meta level, or like, not everyone like desires to have creativity in their lives at the forefront. Like it's kind of
not at all.
Yeah.
It isn't clear to me that it's a desire or a calling. It's an imposition. It's a gift, or you could call it a gift from God or something.
It's a curse / gift. I don't know.
Everything is. I think everything is worth doing. So it doesn't feel like a choice. Because like, yeah, a lot of things that people think are choices, like no one would choose to be such a thing, or no one would to be, and Eve and I have talked about it quite a bit. But I think as people mature into it, they realize it really is a gift. It really is a pleasure to be able to, again, even be in these modes of exploration. It's it's kind of surreal when you think about the last 3,000, 4,000 years of humanity. Again, it's crazy. I try to keep that frame. Even when I'm like a little disturbed by technology, it's like, well, I've been offered I've been just like make drawings, put them on Tumblr, get jobs. It's like, one must remain in a frame of gratitude, I think.
Yeah.
And I'll bring it back to Berkeley. You know what I'm saying? It's the Berkeley way.
That's the Berkeley way.
Now, wasn't there a cafe gratitude there or something? Is that
there was, and there was this like humiliating way you had to order. We had to say like, I am, like the name of the food would be like, I am ecstatic, or like, I am something. And if you didn't say it that way, they would be pretty
the worst. It's the worst.
Pretty the worst. Yeah.
That's like the opposite of your art. That's what I'm saying. These zones of tyranny like that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's what it is.
Yeah, it's funny.
All right, let's try to go through one more project. Let's see if we can understand a little more.
I mean, I can tell you about the stuff I used to do that I don't do so much anymore. I mean, there's a lot of things. There's a lot of weird stuff. I mean, I'll tell you an example of like poetry, for instance. Like, I'm like, how does my poetry, how does like wanting to write poems exist in my current practice? And I'm like, oh, I just keep a Google Doc open of poetry that I write, and sometimes people show up inside of it. And I'm like, oh, suddenly this is a technology project. And I'm like, oh, that feels like it's connected to like the rest of my art practice. But I don't know. For a long time, I was also doing these like more legibly like, I don't know, like VR experiences that were these kind of like little, and I maybe go back to this kind of work, but I'm sick of VR in a big way. Like, one of my favorite ones that I had made, like something that I still feel like I was like onto something that I appreciate now, was this piece that was called Touching a Cactus. So at the time, VR was still pretty new, and I had this like concept in my head of like, well, what can VR do that like other technologies can? And it's like, oh, they can simulate things, but they can't simulate touch. And so I was at this like crazy cactus store with my friend. Actually, it's this place in LA. I think it's called the Cactus Store. Maybe you know that place. And
no, I thought you were going to talk about that place near Berkeley. That was crazy.
No, there was like a crazy one in Berkeley. I think cactus people are just crazy.
It was awesome. No, I mean, it was mostly just the realization of how expensive a giant cactus is.
Oh my God, they're so expensive. And they can be like passed down by thousand generations and whatever. So I don't know. Who knows? Maybe they should be. Anyway, so in this VR piece, I was like, oh, wouldn't it be funny if there was like this simulation of you, like you just have a giant hand and you just touch this cactus. And then I was like, okay, that's like the starting point for this idea. And then that unfolded into this piece that's like, and this is like a format I was working in for a while of like vignettes. So there's like 5 vignettes, and each of them is like a little situation. And you move through the situations by doing an action. So in the first one, you're touching a cactus, and it will read out in the audio a line of a random line of an 80-line poem that I wrote. And if you touch the cactus 5 times, it takes you to the next scene. And in the next scene, your hand is a cactus, and there's like a balloon that you have to try to, your hand has like spines like a cactus, and there's a balloon that you have to try to grab. And as soon as you grab it, it pops and it reads you another line of the poem, and then takes you to the next vignette, which is like, you have your hand, and then there's a mirror of your hand doing the same thing. And if you hold your own hand, it'll read the line of a poem and then take you to the next scene, where suddenly your hand is like a cursor, from a computer. And there's a giant computer, and the lines of the poem are written on the computer. And basically you just like whack the face of this computer. I think maybe, I don't remember exactly the number of times or what the exit like conditions were, But then it'll read you the last line of the poem, and then there's like either a laugh track or a clap track or something, and then it like starts the loop over again. So you can like go through it a whole bunch of times, and each time you would be hearing a different poem, basically a different recombinatory poem, but the metaphors are the same in each of the spaces. And there's like sound design, and there's like different kinds of like visual effects in each of the scenes. I think I missed one, but whatever, you get the idea. So that was like a format I was working on for a while. These like sort of really minimal like virtual world poem vignette things. If that makes sense. I don't know what to call those. They're like poems, but they're just VR somehow.
No, that's great. That's a good example of how those things cross-pollinated. Yeah. It's also, you're starting to just, it's interesting because you can't really experience a lot of your work without, in some ways, being in a place. And I hadn't thought about that concept. Like, it seems like you kind of have to be wearing a headset, or maybe now people could do it with their own headset. Is that accurate? Yeah. I mean, I don't really have these works. A big problem in like software art is like maintenance. So like, it's tricky. I never thought about it when I first started making this stuff, but when I started working with the gallery, they got very serious about it. And they were like, because they sell the gallery that I work with, like, will sell like software editions of something, which I thought was like so stupid at first. But I'm like, oh, I get it, because someone has to maintain, like, if I sell this work to a collector, I need to have like a contract with them, because I'm not like a team of people. So if it needs like an update or something, like I need to have some mechanism to like facilitate me like either fixing it or doing an upgrade or like hire, like, so it's all really complicated. But it's weird because it's like, I mean, I still think it's kind of stupid, but I also sort of get it, like, and most weird economies are kind of fake anyway. Like, I mean, it's awkward. That might be the best way to describe it. It's just a little awkward. It's an awkward fit. But no, I hadn't even considered that. Yeah. That's a fascinating. I didn't realize you had a gallery, but that's, part of the podcast is I just hope people hear about strange lives and they go, oh, I can do that. Yeah. Not that they will do that, right? Like, it's just that when I was younger, and I'm happy I was ignorant, but I really didn't have a conception of how you would continue to draw and make money, or continue to make things and make money. Yeah. And I celebrate that kind of, again, it's an ignorance, but that lack of knowledge. But I think now it's a different game, and I think one has to be informed about these different avenues. I mean, I certainly didn't know anything. Like, I knew like 4 jobs when I was growing up. And I thought, funnily enough, I was like, I have no clue what kind of job I'm going to have. And my mom's like, oh, you'll be like a high school English teacher. And I was like, no, I won't. And then like at the end of the day, I'm still sort of a teacher. She's just kind of right. Like, I'm like, that's cool, Mom. Like, but I do think exposing people to all the different ways of making. I mean, is that what drives you? Like, what's driving you to do this podcast? I'm curious. Well, I think from a practical sense, I live in a suburb of New Jersey, and I know that I need to be proactive about maintaining connections. Like, they won't just come to me like if I lived in New York or Oakland. So it really has to be a conscious effort. But also, I genuinely am curious about how people end up where they're at. Like, I've always enjoyed, I love my 10-year reunion of high school. I love seeing like this compression of time and yeah, just like funky lives, and how people manage their own passions and desires. And I just like talking to people. So yeah, it's a low cost way to stay connected. It's a low cost way to flatter artists, and people like to be flattered. It's a fun way to, I'll interview people, I get to meet people, and I'll work with them almost instantly on stuff, whether it's fabrication at the art center or drawing based stuff. So I think in a really simple sense, it's a little way to extend a hand, Yeah. And it's not going to make I really doubt it loses money, but it's small enough where it doesn't matter too much.
Yeah.
And I guess I also like always being a little delayed. So I probably should have started doing it a long time ago when podcasts were more relevant, but I think I trust myself more when I'm like a year or two behind.
Yeah.
My intentions, I suppose.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I like that it's just talking. There's no visual component. And it's a fascinating way to catch up with people. But yeah, it's really just about, as cheesy as it is, it's just about connecting with people and staying connected.
Yeah.
And having I used to maintain a Tumblr, and that made it a little easier to reach out to other people doing so. But I don't really care about social media anymore. So
good for you.
Well, it's good and bad, right? But I wanted to have a thing that I could still approach people with that help them in some sense. I used to run the gallery, so that was a step in that direction, I think, of getting out of the isolated mode of drawing in a room. So for me, like, the last 5 years is really an experiment and an embodiment of that idea, or total rejection of whatever type of introversion I thought I had.
Interesting.
Yeah, an absolute obliteration of it.
Interesting.
Just complete. Yeah, that's a very long topic. My views on introversion.
That's its own interesting.
Yeah, I think it's just very misunderstood conflation.
Are you introverted? Or is that not a term that you would use?
I don't think I am, because I only am when I'm depressed, and I don't think that's how it works. Like, that just means I'm hiding from something. But I mean, I don't even know. I never had the opportunity to be it or not, because I have 4 brothers, and all 5 of us were in 2 rooms that were small. So it's like, even if I wanted to be, I feel like, thankfully, I was forced into a kind of social orientation. And so I probably am, like, maybe inherently so, but thank the Lord, I was kind of like disallowed
That's interesting.
The opportunity to embrace
it. It's hard to be an introvert and really because social isolation happens, and it's really it's hard. It's hard.
Oh, it's just like objectively a bad thing in my opinion. Like, I respect hermits and such, but I don't think. Yeah, I could talk on that for a long time. I just think, in my experience, you have to deal with the fact that you're a social creature, and you have to deal with it in the meat world. Really. Yeah. I don't think it's sufficient to deal with it in your VR nonsense. No, I'm kidding.
No,
with your
totally
avatars.
I totally agree. I'm not offended by that in the slightest.
So if someone wanted to experience, I like to end it on a note where someone can actually experience firsthand the work someone makes. Is that possible?
Yeah, totally. I mean, there's a few things happening for me in the next. So, like, in physical space, I have this show at the Museum of Moving Image in October, but those will also be live streamed onto thing.tube. Whatever that ends up being. And then I'm going to do some kind of experimental performance at this place called the Center for Performance Research in December. And then I have a show. I have my first solo show in New York in March, I guess. So those are 3 things. But also all of I keep a pretty active, updated website, and some of the work can be experienced like the meetings and stuff. There's video cuts of those, or even the things that you can't see, you can see the kind of video documentation of, which are kind of their own little pieces in a way.
Gotcha.
Yeah, that's where that stuff exists.
Okay.
Sort of nowhere, and also very highly specific places.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for your time.
Yeah, it was really nice to talk to you. It'd be cool to see you someday. All right, take care. Bye.
Have a good night. Music by Dori Bavarsky and Mingja Chen. Hope you have a wonderful week. Be well.
Sarah Rothberg.